I actually have a physical copy of this book, so I can hold it up to the camera, you know, like a proper booktuber, I think. So I'm going to talk about Gideon the Ninth today. I am just so happy to get to talk about lesbians. I think I've been needing this in my reading for a little while, and it's good to kind of be able to have a book that I can talk about. I am going to gush about this book, so I think I should start with some of the things. This is not a perfect book. It does have some pretty significant flaws, and I could imagine that those flaws would lead people to kind of turn away from it because of those flaws, and I totally understand that. So I think I want to start by talking about that. What are the flaws of this book? The book has a very slow start. It really takes a while to pick up, and there is a lot of the early parts of the book where I found myself going, is anything gonna happen in this book, or are we just gonna hang out in this palace the whole time, not talking to our friends? I guess that's sort of where I was. This stems from two decisions that Muir made that I think really compounded each other. The first one is not really that bad, and the second one is a little bit worse. The first one is that the main character, Gideon, is not a kid. The first one is that the main character, Gideon, does not have any agency. She's an indentured servant to the House of the Ninth, which means that she is bound to do whatever Harrow tells her. She is thrust into the story against her will. In the very beginning of the book, she's trying to escape, and Harrow essentially prevents her from escaping and co-opts her into being her cavalier. This on its face is not a bad decision. There are plenty of stories about characters who lack agency, but through the course of the story, learn to exert agency over their own lives, or learn to escape the situations where they are being, where their agency is being taken from them. And those stories are great. That's not a bad decision in and of itself, but it is compounded by the second decision, which I think kind of makes it worse. The second decision is that our point of view character is not in the room where the plot is happening for the first third to half of this book. When Gideon and Harrow get to the palace, they are, Harrow orders Gideon not to talk to anyone. So now Gideon is bound by this oath of silence, and then Harrow abandons Gideon to herself while going off to explore, and all of the plot stuff is kind of happening where Harrow is. So for the first third of this book, our point of view character is not involved in the plot, and she is instead just sort of hanging out with a bunch of people she's not allowed to talk to. So you really get the sense of her as just like a fly on the wall. This has an advantage in that we sort of get to see that these other houses. But for me, meeting these heroes and meeting these other characters was inconsequential. It did not feel like anything was happening. So in the later parts of the book where these characters do become important, I found myself wondering, wait a minute, which character is this again? And having to flip back to earlier parts in the book to remember who they were or who each person was. Or I found myself going wait a minute, is this the person who was organizing the duels? Is this the person that's that Gideon had a crush on earlier? And I kept having to go back to refresh my memory about who these characters were. So that's the first one. Those two things sort of compound each other. I think that they make the book have a very, very slow start. It does pick up once Gideon does kind of take matters into her own hands and then becomes part of the plot. It does pick up. And I think that those are the best parts of the book for me. I did almost DNF this book twice, and I pushed myself through by saying, oh, well, there's lesbians in this book. It is queer representation, and maybe I should just let's just give it a couple more chapters and see if see if it pulls through. And it did thankfully pull through, but not without me forcing my way through it, which I think is a detriment to the book. Another thing that sort of is a drawback to this book is that it uses a lot of anachronistic language. There's a lot of it is a young adult book, so it is aimed at teenagers, and there's a lot of sassy teenage voice happening, which at first kind of gnawed at me, and then by the end of the book I sort of didn't mind it that much, and I think I was just giving it a pass on this because of it having lesbian representation. If somebody didn't like this book, I would understand why they don't like it, is what I'm trying to say. I think that there's a lot of reasons not to like it. There are some criticisms of this book that I've seen that I don't agree with, and I'll talk about those shortly. So from here on out, I'm gonna gush about this book because it did, in the end, I ended up warming up to it, and it sold me. I ended up bought into the book by the end of it. As I said, Gideon does eventually decide to have her own agency. Harrow has kind of left Gideon a bunch of notes, and Harrow has told Gideon not to come looking for her and not to try to find her. So eventually Harrow is missing for several days, and Gideon takes it upon herself to go and find Harrow. And from this point on, Gideon becomes a more central part of the story. Gideon kind of saves Harrow, although Harrow doesn't view it that way. And from this point on, the book becomes a mystery, and sort of a puzzle box and a murder mystery and kind of a secret about the world mystery. And also the book starts to become about Gideon's past and things about her past that are not known to her, or things that she has assumed about her past that maybe don't make sense, right? And from this point on, you're really working through these varied mysteries of the book. And this engaged me, actually. This it seemed like right as I got to a point where I was ready to DNF the book, and I said, you know what? I'm gonna give it 2 more chapters. It seems like right after that moment, the book picked up and all of these sort of mysteries started happening, and I started being okay, now I want to dissect this and figure out what's going on. And I think that really that stuff was great. I liked it. I liked the sort of, okay, these trials for lictorhood are a puzzle box that you're trying to put together and piece together and open and learn the secret inside, right? So what happens is that you find out that Harrow, in order to become a lictor, is going through these necromantic challenges where she's having to do things that are not supposed to be possible according to necromantic, everything that everybody knows about necromancy. In fact, one of the chapters, one of the characters even says there's, it violates the laws of physics. And so you're sort of piecing this mystery apart. You're teasing it apart and unraveling it. And this made the magic of the world, the magic system, feel really intricate and well thought out, even though it's not told to you in sort of scientific terms. They talk about the necromancy in terms of necromantic theorems that describe how necromancy works. And they talk about learning new things about necromancy. So that was all great, and it made me really want to learn more about necromancy in this world and want to learn more about how the magic worked and everything there. And this is also coupled with a murder mystery that's happening in this palace at the same time, which I am a big murder mystery fan. I love the Knives Out movies. I think they're perfect movies. I love murder mysteries, so I was kind of invested in that too. It really spoke my language a little bit. And then you have the relationship of Harrow and Gideon. Early in the book, the relationship between Harrow and Gideon is very antagonistic. It's very like, you can tell that they are they've been together for their whole lives. You do find out that an entire generation of children died and that Harrow and Gideon are the only two people left. This is also kind of a thing, a secret of Harrow's past. And I think at this point, I'm gonna have to give like a spoiler warning for the rest of this video. So if you want to read this book and you're kind of sold on the aspects that I've talked about, and you're sold on the idea of like Harrow and Gideon's relationship being really well done and well portrayed, and the fact that there are lesbians in this book, and that it is very queer as a book. If that sold you on it and you care about spoilers, you should probably ignore the rest of this video. The relationship between Harrow and Gideon is complicated because Harrow has really abused Gideon. Gideon's an indentured servant, so she doesn't have agency over herself, and she's kind of trapped. And because Gideon is the point of view character, you kind of assume that Harrow is this abusive, toxic person. And she is, sort of. Like, she is kind of, like, she does take advantage of Gideon. She does bully Gideon. She does abuse Gideon. There are those things happening. But in chapter 31, there's also scenes, sorry, before we talk about chapter 31, there's also scenes where you kind of get the sense that maybe Harrow isn't like a total, I'm probably gonna have to bleep that out. And those scenes start to maybe make you think that maybe your perception of Harrow is colored by Gideon's perspective. And that, to me, came to a head in chapter 31. Chapter 31 is the chapter where Harrow says to Gideon, "Come with me. Now is the time where I tell you everything." And they have it out. They like Harrow tells Gideon everything. The secret of why there are no other children from their generation, the secret of who Harrow is, what Harrow did as a child, why Harrow's parents took their own lives, why Harrow didn't take her own life despite the fact that that was what was supposed to happen, why Gideon has been abused and mocked and treated as less than human by the House of the Ninth, and why Harrow has felt this immense guilt and shame and all this trauma that they share. And this, to me, was one of this chapter. This chapter, it's very late in the book, right? Like it is a good thing that the mystery elements got me to this chapter, because this chapter is about 70% of the way through the book. And this was the chapter where I was like, holy shit, okay, I'm into this book now. You've sold me on this whole world. You've sold me on these characters. You sold me on their relationship. And it kind of solidified it for me that they have a very complex relationship. At this point, it's probably good for me to talk about one of the criticisms that this book gets that I disagree with. So on the front cover of the book, it says, "Lesbian necromancers explore a haunted Gothic palace in space." It's a quote from another author. And because of this, people have criticized this book because the main character, Gideon, is a lesbian. And the criticism that they will levy is that Harrow is not explicitly said to be a lesbian in the text. And so it's sort of promising you this necromantic lesbian romance that isn't in the book. The thing I will say is that I never saw any marketing about this book that said that it was a romance. And just because the characters involved are also, I think it also presupposes that a romance has to be something where the characters end up together at the end. And in this book, they don't at the end. Gideon ends up sacrificing her own life for Harrow to become a lictor, and so they don't end up having a romantic thing. But I think this criticism that it is promising lesbian necromancers and not delivering, I think the only way that you can make this claim is to willfully misinterpret some scenes in the book that I think are pretty explicit in showing that Harrow is attracted to women. She might not be a lesbian, but she is at the very least attracted to women. She could be bisexual, but I think that these scenes are there to sort of explicitly tell you that she finds Gideon attractive and she's attracted to Gideon. There's a couple, the scenes that I'm thinking of in question, there's a scene where they decide to go and see Dulcinea, who is one of the other necromancers, and Gideon is so happy that Harrow has listened to her and taken her advice that she embraces Harrow and picks her up off the ground. And Harrow has all the power in their relationship, could push her away, is a necromancer, has shown that she has the necromantic ability to like conjure skeletons to hold Gideon down, Like that's one of the first things that happens in the book. And Harrow just doesn't do anything, just freezes and kind of stands there, and lets Gideon hug her. She doesn't hug Gideon back, but she lets Gideon hug her. And she has this sort of look on her face, this quizzical look. So that's one scene, and that's not explicitly romantic, but there is a sort of thing where you can feel kind of the tension starting to break. There is a scene where one thing about them having it out and talking about, Harrow having looked in the locked tomb, which he wasn't supposed to do, and Gideon feeling responsible for the death of Harrow's parents, and Harrow kind of feeling responsible for the fact that Gideon survived when none of the other children survived, and all of the children's death, these 200 children that died to create Harrow. One of the things about this scene is that I found myself recontextualizing every interaction that Harrow has with Gideon, because Harrow, in some sense, has, I think in her own way, has been protecting Gideon this entire time through the palace. She's warned Gideon not to talk to anyone because she sees Gideon getting closer to people who would be a threat to Gideon. She warns Gideon not to do any duels. She tells Gideon to stay in the room and to not come looking for her and not to go into the challenge rooms where people are dying, where people end up dying. And I think that that's because Harrow understands that the challenges are a life threat. And this recontextualized all of that for me. And the only time that Harrow ever asks Gideon to put her life on the line, she asks Gideon to do it. She does not order her, which is something she could very easily do. And Gideon agrees to do this. And then Harrow says, like, you're just going to do it because I asked? And Gideon says, that's all I ever wanted you to do was to ask, right? And then after they've had this scene where they've had all of this like emotional trauma and all of it has come to the surface and they've actually talked to each other, after they've done that, Gideon apologizes, and Harrow, that scene is just so powerful. And then hugs Harrow. And initially Harrow is going to succumb to it because she thinks Gideon is trying to drown her, and Harrow is ready to die. Harrow is ready to die, right? But then she realizes that Gideon's not trying to drown her. Gideon is trying to console her. And she starts to fight back against this, and then eventually succumbs to it. And they're floating, after all of this, they float in the pool holding hands. And I don't know how you read this scene as anything other than having romantic undertones. Like, this is the scene where all of their emotional baggage has come to the surface, and they've talked about it. And then they sit up on the pool after this, and Gideon leans into Harrow, and you think that Gideon's going to kiss her, and Harrow freezes. And I think it's pretty clear that Harrow thinks that Gideon is going to kiss her, just by the way that it's written, by the way that Harrow is characterized in the scene. And then when Gideon doesn't kiss her, when Gideon like makes fun of her for being attracted to a dead girl, Harrow summons a skeleton and kicks Gideon into the pool. And I don't know how you read this scene as not being a romantic scene between the two of them. And I don't know how you read this scene and come away from it thinking that Harrow is straight. Like, I just don't think that that's in the book. Now, that's not to say that their relationship is good, right? There were definitely sort of toxic, traumatic elements of their relationship. And it's not necessarily a healthy relationship, but I don't think you can view Harrow as straight in this book. So I don't take that as a criticism. I think the people who have that criticism are not reading the book well. So now I think it's time to talk about the end of the book. One, the end of the book is incredible, I think, just the action scenes and the final battle. And then Gideon at the end of the book sacrifices herself for Harrow to become a lictor. And Harrow feels such an immense guilt for this. And you can kind of see it. And Harrow defeats it. You know, I already said that we're talking in spoiler-free land. So Dulcinea is a character who was killed long before these lictor trials started. And Dulcinea ends up being one of the original lictors. And the secret is that the lictors, in order to be lictors, are necromancers who have taken the lives of the cavaliers and bonded their souls to the necromancer themselves. This allows them to perpetually be full of thanergy, because they have this soul, this living soul, and lets them live for thousands of years because they have this life force to draw upon. And when they discover this, they realize that Dulcinea is an imposter and has been impersonating one of the lictors, or is a lictor who has been impersonating Dulcinea. And then they fight her. And all of this stuff sort of happens. Gideon sacrifices herself, Harrow becomes a lictor, and then enters the lictor service for the emperor. And I don't know, the ending of this book, this is really a case for me where I feel like the ending of this book saved it. And I feel bad because I think a lot of people could read this book and have a very legitimate reason to not finish it and to not want to read the rest of the books. But I found myself falling in love with it by the end, and it totally won me over. And I really liked it, despite the fact that it does have a lot of flaws. The first half of the book is so slow. It's so slow. And it does feel like nothing is happening and you feel like you're making no progress. But by the end, I just didn't care about that. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. I'm glad I got to talk about it. I'm so glad that I got to talk about a queer book. I think I've been needing this a lot. I think I've been needing to be able to just like explore queer fiction, and I'm really, really excited. I am in the middle of Wrath Goddess Sing, so that's gonna be coming up soon. And then I know I said I wasn't gonna read any straight fiction for a while, but Oathbound comes out tomorrow, so I am going to be downloading that. I have a pre-order, so I'm gonna be reading that when it comes out, probably. But I think the second book, I've been trying to read 2 books at a time, and I'm trying to make sure that one of the books I read is always some form of queer representation. So thank you so much for watching the video. I have failed to do calls to action at the end. So if you read this book and you have thoughts, let's talk about it down below.